So my name is Frans-Willem Korsten. I work at the Film and Literary Department in Leiden, University of Leiden, and in Rotterdam at the Erasmus School of History, Culture and Communication. But I'm also connected to the Piet Zwart Institute, where I'm doing the critical pedagogy seminar at the Meyer track.
My name is Zwijnenberg. I'm Professor of Art and Science Interactions at the Faculty of Humanities of Leiden University. And I'm interested in artists that go into the lab and engage with the ethical, societal, political implications of biotechnology.
My name is Kristine Steenbergh. I work in the English Literature Department at the Vrije Universiteit, where we've just founded an Environmental Humanities Center that aims to bring together a community of students and researchers and people from outside the university around the question of our relation to the environment. So we're interdisciplinary, and we just started in November last year. So we're experimenting mainly with how to bring all these people together.
We're doing a round of introductions, TJ. You'll be the last, so welcome.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think you probably all met me this morning. I'm Amy Herron Chapman. I'm an artist and writer and co-founder of the Distance Plan, a platform that seeks to promote the discussion of climate change within the arts. How do we give him the microphone?
Yeah, TJ, we can hear you. Could you briefly introduce yourself, because there's an audience that's not exactly the same as that of yesterday?
Sure. I'm TJ Dimas. I'm a professor at the University of California in Santa Cruz, and I'm also the director of the Center for Creative Ecologies. My work in general concerns the intersection of art, politics, and ecology. My most recent book is called Decolonizing Nature, Contemporary Art and the Politics of Ecology. That came out in 2016 from Steenbergh Press. I run the Center for Creative Ecologies, which is a place at UC Santa Cruz that tries to develop a platform for interdisciplinary conversations about art and ecology. So it's in a way it's a response to the proliferation of environmental humanities institutes in the country and internationally. So it's asking, what would an environmental arts institution be that could facilitate arts-led research within the environmental realm?
Okay, welcome. So the topic of the panel will be how the arts and the sciences, art and the humanities relate to one another in the Anthropocene. So what does that mean? If we kind of take the Anthropocene as a point of departure, what would that mean in terms of educating people, educating artists, designers, and so forth? Right. So in that context, my first topic that I would like to kind of reflect on, or that I would like you to reflect on, is if we take a look at the history of the humanities, for instance, which have their distinct roots in Europe and in the UK and in the United States. So there might be a difference that we want to talk about. But the first thing that I would like to discuss is, if we take a look at the development of the humanities, they kind of come to exist in the 19th century in the context of the nation states. And in a sense, that still is an agenda that determines their existence. So if we take the Anthropocene as our kind of frame, what does that mean for the position of the humanities? What would it mean in terms of policies, but also what would it mean in terms of the context of the neoliberal universities, of knowledge economies, and so forth? What would you say, panel? Actually, I can kind of make it more basic. Is the Anthropocene a frame that kind of would be able to really help the humanities to reorient themselves in relation to the world as it is?
It's a huge question.
It's a huge question, yes.
I'm going to approach it from a very
Okay.
specific angle, triggered by the word neoliberal there and the neoliberal university. I think one of the things that the neoliberal university does is focus on output and short-term projects and not give people a lot of time to think broadly about their subjects. And I think one of the things that the humanities is good at is making broad connections, seeing things in their complexity, perhaps what Don Haraway calls staying with the trouble. So one of the things we're trying to do in our Environmental Humanities Center is get lots of people into our meetings and allow lots of room to listen to each other and to talk about things. And it's really something that people in the sciences, that it feels like a kind of liberation to them to think philosophically or ethically about topics that they've been thinking about in a much more pragmatic or but out of a certain kind of curiosity, but that's led into certain paths in their projects. And so, in a way, really connecting to what Frauke was talking about, listening to each other first and taking lots of time to get to know each other and what concepts mean. And then you can shape new connections and see things in even more of their complexity because you take time to listen to each other. And I'm not sure if the humanities are particularly good at that, but I do feel that we tend to look at things in all their connections, which makes it more difficult to comprehend sometimes, and not focus on one question and isolate all kinds of factors and then solve that problem and then move on to the next question. And I have the feeling that that attracts lots of people to our centre because it gives you the time to think about things in more, from more perspectives and in all their complexity.
But this must mean that you either have a very generous university, because if I would kind of translate this to what the government is doing, they wouldn't be giving real money to people who do slow science, because that's actually what you're saying, right?
Yeah. Well, we don't get a lot of money. It's just people who are enthusiastic about this. I mean, we call ourselves a centre, but we don't even have an office or a room. We had journalists coming in from Elsevier saying, "So where's your building?" And we said, "No, it's just us here." We have these meetings on Friday afternoon. We take 2 hours and we have drinks after, which is very important because people stay for like 2 hours longer and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. So we're building up this kind of community of people who've been to our meetings and who come out of their comfort zones and are willing to listen to each other and to kind of share ideas.
So it's a bottom-up process then?
It's a bottom-up process. Yeah, but it's supported by, I mean, our university is not working against it. They very much appreciate what we're doing. Yeah.
Can I
yeah.
just say a brief thing? I already said this afternoon, so but I'll say it again, and it's what you mentioned yesterday, that if we're talking about the humanities and if the Anthropocene is a useful frame for the humanities, I think roll it back one more time, and as you mentioned, you said I think the Anthropocene is a boundary period, or ideally we'd think about it like this. So I don't think we want to be here in the Anthropocene, and so how the humanities acts within this is should be rolled back. How do the humanities get out of the Anthropocene along with the rest of humanity? I would say is my brief framing of
That's a vast task. Yeah. TJ, what would you say?
I would want to point out from and speak from the context that we find ourselves in the States, and say that doing humanities and arts-based research within the university that is increasingly becoming subjected to a neoliberal logic is very difficult, and there's really important antagonisms that we need to address here between the humanities and neoliberalism. One of Donald Trump's earliest executive orders was to sign a statement of his intention to defund the national endowments of the humanities in the States. I worked in London for 10 years before coming to California, and throughout that time there was also a similar disparagement of humanities-based research, as well as arts-based research as fields of inquiry that are just no longer useful and are no longer valuable according to the economic logic of neoliberalism. And I think that this is a real problem, and it's not actually just the humanities and the arts. It turns out that neoliberalism, at least in its current iteration under Trump, whether we can call that neoliberalism at all, or some kind of new type of authoritarian capitalism, a post-liberal formation, they don't really like science either. So the relation between the economic framework that we're finding ourselves in, and the way it's politicized, has a real and growing antagonism to fields of research. So I think that's important to point out. On the other hand, I think the humanities, of course, based along the lines of the human as the center of its research interests, in some ways might be considered increasingly outmoded. As we live in an era of multi-species assemblages and increasing attention to the fact that there is no such thing as a discrete and sovereign subject that is the human. So maybe the humanities needs to rethink itself, and maybe even the terminology is in some ways in need of reinvention. So I think the Anthropocene, which also reinscribes itself within a human-based anthropocentrism, potentially, also we need to think critically about. And so how do we put these things together? I think if we're going to use these terms, and it looks like we have to be realistic and accept the fact that they've become basically institutionalized. I think it's impossible not to turn to the Anthropocene and ask critical questions of what it means to do humanities research within the Anthropocene in order to save the humanities, in order to make the humanities relevant and necessary to the definition of the world and the creation of alternative ones as we look at this future of potential catastrophic climate change.
Mm-hmm. Well,
But
something?
may I ask something?
Yeah, of
Do you
course.
want to save humanities or save humanity?
TJ, the question is humanities or humanity? Passport Toto. Yeah.
Sorry.
One requires the other. Right?
There's not going to be any humanities without the humans.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think we have to save one and then the other.
Yeah, okay. Okay, Rob. Yeah.
So I'd like to follow up on what TJ was saying, that to me the Anthropocene is a challenge to the humanities to reconsider itself. And of course that has already been done by people like Baidotti or Karen Barrett or Timothy Morton. But it's also a chance, or an opportunity for the humanities to team up with the arts. And I think that is really important, because if there's something that the Anthropocene is pointing us, is that we should change our attitude into this non-anthropocentric attitude, this non-anthropocentric approach of what we would call the non-human. And I think that only arts would be capable of trying to give us a kind of idea of what would that mean to live a non-anthropocentric life. So we can talk about a non-anthropocentric attitude on this theoretical level, but how to live a non-anthropocentric life, how to do that in our daily life, I think that can only be imagined or activated by artists. And I can say more about that, but perhaps we can say that.
TJ is nodding. Something to add, TJ?
No, I completely agree. I think art is a unique place, a unique platform from which to think creatively about how to live differently in the world, how to develop a new value system, new perceptions, new affects, new desires. Right. That's exactly what it does. And artists are in a unique position to propose and experiment with these different ways of being and relating to others, including non-human or the more than human. And I think that this is part of the crisis that we're facing, the radical transformation of our environments at the very time when the arts are largely often disavowed or seen as frivolous by scientists sometimes, as well as politicians often. So I think that it's a real crisis point where we need to speak up for the art's relevance, and the importance of the creativity that the arts can uniquely offer.
Yeah.
Again, I completely agree with TJ, and I think the only direction that art can take in this, so it's indeed about the relevance and urgency of art in our days, and that is a big task for the arts to do. And I think the only way is to appropriate biotechnology, because I think that biotechnology, all the biotechnological innovations, really give us the opportunity to exchange in a different way with all living systems, to collaborate with living systems in a totally different way than we are used to now. But that also means that artists should appropriate biotechnology in such a way that they move biotechnology away from anthropocentrism.
It almost sounds like a curse. Anthropocentrism.
It is.
It is. Can I bring in, let's say, one nasty point here? In these 2 days, the term Anthropocene seemed to have a Janus-like face, so it has two faces. One would be, so if we go back to Paul Crutzen, who kind of coined the term, he's a scientist, right? And if we read his articles, he's also talking about, let's say, the possibility of geoengineering, of human beings being the stewards of the world, which to me seems to be in conflict with the idea that we consider the Anthropocene in terms of some sort of post-human or kind of even anti-human-like thing. So how do the two come together, and why would art only be connected to the nice part of the two, right? Mm-hmm. So why would art not be kind of taken up by neoliberalism, by capitalism, by biotechnology as a useful tool to be creative and invent the next thing?
It's called advertising.
Yeah. So could we reflect on these two meanings of the Anthropocene? So either it's used by people who say we can manage this. Yes, we are in the Anthropocene, and this means that human beings are in control of the entire system. We will all become Dutch. Paul Crutzen was Dutch, and we made this little land. So now we're going to make the globe, right? And then the other idea would be we have to redefine our human subjectivity in relation to all these other beings.
Well, we are in control. Yeah? We can say that. We are really in control of everything around us. That was my plea.
Sorry, this is the crisis.
Yeah, that is the crisis. That's why I said that.
We're causing it, but we're not in control of it, I would say.
No, I think we're really in control. Huh? And indeed, that is the crisis. But that's why I said artists should try to appropriate biotechnology and use it in a different direction than it's being used now. So yesterday it was all over the papers that we can now create a hybrid pig, so a human pig chimera. Well, that is a step, a new step into a different relationship with animals, a different relationship with nature. It's a different step into rethinking the nature-culture divide. We can either go the way of biotechnology as it is used now, as applied now, or we can ask artists, humanist scholars, to appropriate biotechnology and use it to establish this new relationship with all living systems around us.
So just to reiterate my point, use the term being in control, and I would say that we're not in control. We've tipped or are tipping a series of Earth's basic systems that have in the past created a relatively stable climate. Now those systems are increasingly out of control. They're out of human control, and yeah. So humans, they have caused this out of controlness, but we are no longer in control. And I think the fallacy of humanity to this point was ever thinking that we did have control over these systems. I think it's very interesting to me that increasingly climate scientists are turning from trying to model Earth systems. They have enough understanding now to know that we're out of control, and now they're trying to model systems of society and culture. For example, this term social tipping points. When will our society tip over to acknowledging that we have to fully de-invest from fossil fuels? What percentage of ethical investment do we need in the fossil fuel industry to get out of it, to transfer to a renewable economy? So these are the kind of, this is I would say, an exciting area of science-humanities interaction where the sciences are modeling human social behavior in an attempt to forecast the degree of crisis we're in.
So we are in control then?
No.
Yes,
Specifically.
this is exactly what you say. We are in control. So things got out of hand,
No.
and then we try to have other directions, or we do this, that. But we are basically doing all this. We are basically in control of what is happening in this earth.
It's observational.
What do you mean by control?
Control means that we are directing all these things that are happening, that we are causing them, that we are doing them.
That does not equal control. I'm very sorry.
TJ, the discussion is shifting from, let's say, the two different meanings of the Anthropocene to what control means. Could you enlighten us?
I can articulate my own view, which is I think, like scientific advances have been pretty incredible within biogenetic technologies, and I think there is an element of control. I don't know how you measure control, but I think the ability for scientists to carry out experiments and to do so with predictable and repeatable, verifiable results is a kind of model of control. But I think where the problem is the belief that that humanity, or at least the scientific sector and the engineering and design sectors, can control large-scale global Earth systems. And I think that this is where maybe the problem is, and where there's attempts at control, but we're seeing also a massive breakdown in the ability to control Earth's natural systems, including its the various ecosystems and webs of life that make up Earth. I mean, I think the fact that we're living through what people call the sixth mass species extinction event is a sign that, in some ways, that the Anthropocene has lost control and is depleting the Earth and entering into a period of what Amitav Ghosh calls the Great Derangement. And I think that derangement speaks to the fact that there's some things missing that are critical and even potentially catastrophic. But I would want to add one other thing about biotechnology and geoengineering. I think it's interesting suggestion to say that art should not simply exclude these technologies from its creative repertoire, but actually attempt to intervene. And I would want to add that art can intervene in ways that are not just technological, but also bring ethical, political, and legal considerations within its, the interdisciplinary framework. And the problem that I have with geoengineering as a way to answer climate change disruption is that there's no large-scale global legal system in which to regulate these kind of experiments. And if we look at the brief history of experiments in global geoengineering, they've been carried out by well-resourced nations and corporations in a way that could be characterized as rogue. is outside of international protocol and legal forms of regulation. And I think we desperately need to bring democratic process back into the decisions when we entertain the idea of attempting to carry out geoengineering experiments. Whether they work or not is another question. But I think the problem with geoengineering, with the geoengineering proposition, is that it occurs within the context of a post-democratic, non-regulatory environment. And so it's really quite dangerous in terms of what the implications and the side effects might be, and it could very well make matters worse.
Kristine?
I can only say I agree.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I very much agree, and we had a talk at our center 2 weeks ago with Christopher Preston, who was a visiting professor in ethics, and he specialized in geoengineering, climate engineering, and he talked precisely about this, that if you want to talk about geoengineering, you have to take all its complexity into account. And the people who think up the experiment of, for example, injecting aerosol into the atmosphere, once you do that experiment, once you put some aerosol you're already doing it. So it's not an experiment. It has immediate impact on the entire ecosystem. So you can't really do the experiment and see what happens and then adjust your test. So it has to, before you take the action, you have to take all kinds of considerations into account, and that can't be done from one discipline. It has to be done interdisciplinary, but also with the whole world, really, because you're affecting the entire ecosystem, and all kinds of things come into play. So I completely agree.
Okay. Isabelle Stengers is writing about slow science and complexities and so forth, and taking up the idea of Gilles Deleuze that science, modern science, is kind of bothered by stupidity, which also could be translated as insensibility. And she quotes Whitehead. This is a short quote. "The task of a university is the creation of the future, so far as rational thought and civilized modes of appreciation can affect the issue. The future is big, with every possibility of achievement and of tragedy." So far, you've been talking about, let's say, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, polydisciplinarity. To me, this seems to miss an important point, that we would need a different attitude or different modes of sensibility. So if we talk about agents and agency, are we about to act, or are we about to change the very way in which we act? So if we bring this back to the university and to the way in which it relates to the arts, how could we define such modes of sensibility? And is this the case? Is this a proper question? TJ, you're nodding.
Absolutely, I think it's a crucial question. And since we keep talking about university, I'd like to add the idea of the pluriversity. This is a term that the South African-based philosopher Achille Mbembe discusses in some of his recent work, that we need to move from the idea of a universe, in other words, in the educational context, that which represents a single model that historically has been a Western model, that has also been a colonialist model. We need to move from that to a pluriverse, a different kind of way of educating that draws on different traditions, different epistemologies and cultural and historical and philosophical approaches to thinking about the world, and that's really crucial. And that could potentially bring different forms of sensibility or ways of sensing the world that could give us different kinds of agency. So I think that's actually really crucial, and the Stengers quote that comes out of Whitehead is really important in terms of art's role in creating the future through developing and cultivating different forms of sensibility. Of course, part of the stupidity, I think, that we are stuck within is an inability to imagine what life is like outside of the world of the human. So again, it comes to the anthropocentric nature of human knowledge. So we're living at a time also, I think, where our future has been colonized itself. So again, this is something that's happening in the States with the current presidential administration. What we're seeing is the construction of a world that will determine the future for years to come. And I think it's really important for us and for creative practitioners more broadly to think of ways that we can potentially sabotage that future or decolonize that future, partly by developing new modes of sensibility and epistemologies and considering other worldviews. And I think, for example, indigeneity is a crucial area of thinking that's diverse and could contribute to a new formation of the pluriversity.
Thanks. Others?
I do think that the solution to the problem is indeed education, that we should reform universities by breaking the walls between, let's say, the sciences, the humanities, and the arts. But that will be very difficult. And that's why I'm so insisting on the fact that the humanities and arts should really try to understand what is happening in biotechnology, how biotechnology forces us to reconsider what we are as humans, who we are as humans, which limits we wish to impose on biotechnological innovations. And that can only be done if we reconstruct the university in this place where there is this constant dialogue, or I would say this antagonistic way of approaching each other between the arts, the humanities, and the sciences. So I'm totally against co-creation, but I'm very much for a kind of antagonistic model to make productive the differences between the humanities, the arts, and the sciences, to see if this could lead to a new model of education.
Yeah, I suppose just artists are supposedly good at imagining, so just to jump forward, I wonder, when we succeed in uncoupling economic growth from progress, what are we going to be doing with all our time? I think this is what the humanities are pretty good at imagining. To a certain degree, just to say it another way, we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, but we can have infinite growth in our minds. And I think the type of education that we have to be providing in the future, to paraphrase a New York Times op-ed, is one that is training it's not trying to provide jobs, but training workers. So we need an education system that provides, is one of economic inclusion. So that's the universities, as you say, have to be places that everyone can access, and where everyone will get a training that will not only prepare them for a job, but to prepare them to be in a world perhaps where there are no jobs, where automation has eradicated our jobs, and we have to spend our time imagining, thinking, meditating, not consuming. Yeah.
A meaningful life.
Meaningful life.
I like the word sensitivities, or
Sensibilities.
different ways of sensing, and I'd like to link it to practices, because a lot of our academic practices are quite static, like giving a lecture and having some questions afterwards. And in teaching they are different, but in talking across disciplines, you're nodding no, so I would love to hear from you. But what we try in our centre is to get people to talk to each other and to listen to each other and to come out of their comfort zones. So the word scientific stupidity, I think, I know what she means by it, but it's antagonistic and it kind of divides the humanities from the sciences again. And I think what we need, because the problems are so complex and because our time span is so short, we need to come together and talk together about these problems, but that requires different practices of talking to each other, of really taking time to know what the other means when they use a concept, or when they have ideas about what the humanities are doing that you first need to get past before you can really talk to each other. So we need to think of other kinds of practices in which we take time to first listen to each other, understand each other, and then focus on a pressing problem together with a group of people who kind of have a connection then and can work together to solve it. So if you have ideas, I'm going to talk to you after, but if you have ideas about these kinds of, what kind of practices we could use to get that conversation going, that would be really interesting.
Kristine, I'm going to give you a quote by Karl Marx.
Oh, yeah.
If we want to change the social situation, we need to change the educational system. In order to change the educational system, we need to change the social system. So that's the loop that we're in. But I'm mentioning Karl Marx because he was a great talker, but in the end he didn't get, or let's say the laborers didn't get out of their mess and their exploitation by talking.
Haven't got yet.
By talking. So actually, if I take TJ seriously, if I take ourselves seriously, we are headed for enormous political conflicts in which we will have to fight. Do you think that the universities are going to change into pluriversities just because they would want us to decolonize? I mean, they're part and parcel of the colonizing project, right? So how do we envision these political battles that are ahead of us?
They're happening.
They're happening, yes, yeah, yeah. Sorry, TJ, there's people participating in the audience. We have a revolt here. Yeah. Go ahead, Alistair.
I just think we're still in all our boxes. We have to get out of the boxes. The language we're using, everything. Yeah. Let's talk about some really serious issues. What's come to me in this conference, feelings, 2 words, I had a conversation earlier about it, grief and care. Let's talk about something really simple, not the Anthropocene. I see this word has been stretched in so many dimensions in this conference. It can be manipulated to 1,000 different viewpoints, so maybe it's not a really useful word. But let's talk about the grief. We had mentioned by Uwe and Frauke the death of the Colorado River in 1990. Okay? That was through our control, apparently. Control of water. We have to grieve for some of the things that have happened. That's where we are now, today. And then we have to move forward by caring differently. And that's the tragedy of what's been happening over the last few months. It appears that half of countries don't care for the other half, or half of the world doesn't care for the other half. And this separation, which is potentially very dangerous. So let's not even worry about the future universities. If we start to address issues like grief and care, maybe new universities will emerge, or maybe they'll be called something else. Because even saying what's the future of universities and the humanities and the arts, we're still protecting something.
Yeah.
That's going to be ripped apart if we don't deal with these bigger topics. So I'm positing grief and care into this discussion, because at the moment it's going around in circles about what's good for us.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and just because I have a microphone, part of that is also cultivating empathy. That's the part of.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, panel.
Well, it sounds very sympathetic, but if I listen to the quote of Marx, the only thing we can do is indeed fight, and not physically fight, but fight with our minds. What I try to teach my humanities students is to be as radical, and I teach also art students, is be as radical as the making and thinking of biotechnologies.
What about the other disciplines? Why just biotechnology?
Because I think that biotechnology at this moment is changing our world, is transforming who and what we are.
Yeah.
So
Richard would say it's that cybernetization of the world. It's to bring more control over the world and the environment.
Biotechnology, all these other technologies like cyber technology come together. Yeah? So biotechnology is the real only technology that is now transforming us in every aspect of who and what we are, what the world is, and also
No, it's
how
not. It's a box controlled by very few people. I'm sorry, it is. Despite all the biohacking and everything else, it's a box controlled by invisible structures over which we should really talk about, which involves, again, the grief that we are not in control and we're not in the loop of these debates. So you're promoting another box.
I think, Alistair, what you're saying is, before starting to talk about, let's say, what should we do and design, let's say, the future of a university that as such has failed us, right? The major task would be to sense first what's happening and to take that seriously, right?
Absolutely.
What do the other panel members think? DJ, what do you think? What do you sense?
I would say, in terms of biotechnology, I think it's an interesting term, but not in a specific sense that I think we're understanding it. You know, biotechnology, if we think of those terms, bio is life, and technology is applied forms of knowledge. So how can we think of developing our technologies of living? This is a kind of question that maybe like Guattari would have been very interested in asking. And I think the way biotechnology has been captured within the scientific corporate neoliberal complex is the problem. And I think it was Alistair that was talking about grief and care, and I think this points to exactly what the humanities and the arts can bring to science when all it cares about, when it's subjected to the imperatives of capitalism and the economic interest. Because we forget about grief and care, and I would also add, we forget about forms of relationality, solidarity, ethics, politics, and justice, as well as empathy and action. And these insist on thinking about a wider sphere of human experience, as well as, I think, the term that Donna Haraway proposes, responsibility, where she breaks that up and hyphenates it, so it's the ability to respond. We need to develop our capacities for responsibility. In the widest sense of that term is exactly what's needed so that biotechnology and science in general isn't simply co-opted by economic interests, but can also, and more importantly, has to serve humanity in the widest sense, as well as the wider web of life in ways that are based within an ethical and political and justice-oriented framework. So I think that's, you know, we have to consider ways that art can and humanities can do that. That's
how
I think
to do that. How can we do that?
I think if we're talking about education, that's really critical. So for me, it happens when we don't dismiss or barricade ourselves within the arts from science. I think we do really need to investigate new forms of interdisciplinarity where that term actually means something. And it means insisting on bringing, say, science and justice together. Like, what does it mean to talk about technology, but also ecology and responsibility within new forms of sensibility and creativity? You know, this is a meaningful way of thinking about our curriculums, developing our curriculums and pedagogies of teaching. So I completely agree with whoever's been bringing up the idea, like we have to get outside of our boxes, which in this case is the lecture hall and the seminar room. Like let's have different kinds of conversations. Let's consider different ways of relating to each other. Let's get beyond the podium and the desk and get out into the world. Maybe we need a mobile seminar that floats down a river or goes for a walk in the forest. Like there's all sorts of experimental, creative ways of relating to the world. Let's not close ourselves off to them.
If I may, hi, I'm David Haley, and the first thing that I just wanted to bring up is that I personally wouldn't dare tell artists what they should do. I think that's really dangerous, and that is actually a control situation. I think what we can do is permit artists to take part in these conversations, and just as we've been talking about the Anthropocene becoming a ubiquitous term, I think also the other term that's been bandied around is transdisciplinarity, which again is becoming such a ubiquitous term. I personally, whenever I do use the word transdisciplinarity, insist on using Basarab Nicolescu's version, which is that it is an emergent form that travels between disciplines, across all disciplines, and above all disciplines. It's another thing. It's not just another form of cross-disciplinarity. And I think that is the point at which friends of mine, the Harrisons, talk about post-disciplinarity, and they talk about all the disciplines sitting around a circular table where everybody is equal. And they put in the centre of the table what they refer to as the ennobling problem. I prefer the ennobling question. It doesn't really matter. But the thing is that the issue is the guiding force that should guide all curriculum, in my opinion, through education. And we have the crisis of climate change and the sixth extinction. These are the ennobling questions that need to be addressed by all disciplines equally. I can say now, thank you very much.
It's interesting because something I've been grappling with as an artist, there's this idea if artists should act, or if they should be permitted. I don't know who we would be permitted by, especially in an era where like power has lost all legitimacy. I would say, at least presidential power. But how if artists should act, and here I take my cue from climate scientists who for a long time thought they could produce a certain type of knowledge in a certain type of frame or institution, and are increasingly now realizing that that's not enough, and having to move outside that and to take on another set of responsibilities, another level of communication, not just producing peer-reviewed papers or knowledge, but having to communicate with a broad public. There was the discussion of science and justice working together. Do we, as artists or teachers, have a responsibility? Do we have a choice whether or not we act on these issues around this time? And I think we don't really. Yeah.
Hi TJ, this is Chessa. How are you doing? I actually just wanted to put a plug in for the Science and Justice Research Institute at the UC Santa Cruz, which is, I think, doing amazing things. And they also have an artist in residence program that works with them, and they have events going all the time. So I would just encourage you all to look it up.
We have to move to a final topic. So I have to bring another nasty problem. Grief and care do take time, Alistair. And as Amy told us this morning, the time of useful consciousness is short. So what to do with this nasty aspect? If I take seriously what you all have been saying and what I kind of might have been saying myself, this is an uphill battle, and uphill battles take long. So then the decision is to go back to basic things, disregard the system, create other spaces of education, sense what we sense, decolonize our sensibilities, enlarge them, and take the time. Right?
Well, problem with meeting like this is that we only speak to people who basically agree with each other. that's why I tried to bring some disagreement in it. I think
It worked.
there are no scientists here, for instance. So why are there no scientists here?
I studied life as a scientist. Sorry.
Yeah, but you understand what I'm saying. Huh? So these are people from the humanities, from the arts, and we can have all these wonderful words and dream on like about our ideal world. And of course, I should not say what artists should do, but I think that if art wants to be relevant and urgent in this world, then it should be activistic. Yes? So I'm very much in agreement with people like Chantal Mouffe. Art should be activistic if it is art that is relevant or urgent. Otherwise, it's just commodified art, or we're just talking about aestheticization. So what we should do is indeed permeate the sciences, go into the sciences, not as their friends, but from this antagonistic approach that we have really to bring in something to bring into the sciences that is not there, and that we should not co-create with the sciences, but we should really fight with them and fight for our own position in the debate about all these important issues.
Go ahead.
Just to intercede here, as we saw in the presentation this afternoon with you and Frauke, actually commodifying your art to a certain sense, or your journalistic work, can actually create your autonomy as well. So it's maybe not that simple to say that, you know, it's either you're an activist or you're commodifying, because maybe sometimes you have to commodify to be an activist. I don't know if we have a sort of a post-capitalist parachute yet. Do we? Can you? How do you survive as an activist if you have no income?
We need to eat, we need to eat, and we need to have a house and pay our rent. But if we allow that art falls prey to strategies of commodification and aestheticization, I think, well, okay, then we don't need to talk anymore. So I understand. So I understand what the journalists were saying, that you need to sell and protect your photos and all that sort of things, and that so they commodify indeed their app, but their intention, to me, if I listen carefully to them, was activistic, and that is what I'm saying. As long as your intention is activistic, and I think art should be activistic if they want to play a role, have a function in this world.
Okay. Still, I would like to get back to this nasty problem of time. Yeah. Time?
Yeah.
Do we have time?
No, apparently not, and that's quite. I mean, no. But the word antagonistic and the activism that sounds like a battle against science or something. Yeah. I work on early modern compassion, so I'm all with Alistair and grief and care and developing different modes of interrelating, not only with the environment but with the sciences. I think you have to practice that practice wherever you go, and not just think about it but try to do it. And then when I hear antagonistic or scientific stupidity, I think, yeah, I mean, you can think like that from the humanities or from art and kind of oppose yourself, or you can try and listen to each other, talk to each other, and try to model new practices together. Maybe I'm very optimistic. And I don't know if it has to take a lot of time. I mean, if we go out there, get out of our seminars and interact with people outside the humanities more, and take art into communities and talk to... I love the example of Obamacare, and just listening to people first and then having people come to you and ask why do you think Obamacare is a good thing? I think that could work if you're not just sending messages out all the time, and that activistic, antagonistic for me sounds too much like just throwing our ideas out there, and then they'll get on the big heap of ideas from science, and capitalism will just wash them away again. So that we need to develop new modes of interrelating, I think.
Alistair, how long should we grieve? How long do we need to
Well,
grieve?
I just wanted to say that we have consensual activism too. I have a model which is about is the 3 A's model: agreement, agonism, antagonism, and you can use any of these strategies at the appropriate time. So I think that gives us all a chance, right? The time window is a difficult one, but maybe we can't really move forward until we've resolved what's actually happened to us. But things are moving fast, yes. If we have a human-pig chimera coming soon, we have a 6 DNA model now, just this week, wasn't it? Yes, we need to have deep concern. And so that maybe that's the sort of disappearing window bit, because it seems like the genie's already out of the lamp. And we haven't had a discussion about that. I feel like the whole ethics of what's happening today is bypassing me, and I'm trying to be part of the debate. So that's a big challenge for us all. How do we really keep participating?
I would,
and that's where the grief comes from, I think, a little bit.
I would like to jump in here and say that there is a lot of people already acting. And there's a lot of people already experiencing things like climate change, and to paraphrase Naomi Klein, it's not like telling people what they should do, even telling each other what we should do, but again, going back to this idea of listening, like how our communities who are already lived through a sacrifice zone, how are they coping? How are people who are already experiencing climate change coping? People who already have first-hand, first-person climate knowledge, as someone like me might coin it. Yeah, so radical empathy. How are people who are already dealing with these subjects coping, and what can we learn from them? How are scientists who are already seen their discipline become highly politicized? How have they coped? We going back out, listening to these things, taking advice.
Thanks. TJ, we have 1 minute, so that's yours.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to wrap up by mentioning a few different things. When it comes to grief, I think back to the precedent within the U.S. context of the AIDS crisis and the work of Douglas Crimp, who was within the arts, a writer and an activist at the time, and he wrote an essay called Mourning and Militancy. What he wanted to articulate is the need to avoid sinking into a debilitating form of melancholia. We need to grieve indeed, but we also need to be politically engaged, and we need to stop the direction of what's happening. So he brought these two terms together, mourning and militancy, within that context, and I think that they could be expanded upon today, and I think that's what I would want to add to it. I think it's crucial to listen to frontline communities, and an example of that today is the Standing Rock protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline that brings together Dakota Sioux and many other American indigenous groups fighting against the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure after decades and indeed centuries of colonialism and genocide in the States. It's crucial to learn from these experiences, to mourn with them and enter into militant solidarity with them as well in the transformation of our society. And then finally, in relationship to science and the arts and education, what we need is more institutions. We need to build creative institutions. That's what I've tried to do with the Center for Creative Ecologies, and we need others like it, where we can reinvent new and provocative and meaningful models where disciplines can respond to each other, work together, work against each other, insist on justice, insist on scientific knowledge that's framed within an ethical context, and invent new modes of sensibilities that can respond to and transform our world. So that's a lot to think about, but indeed, with the problem of climate change in general, this is a wicked, complex problem, and we need complex, multifaceted solutions that are collaborative, collective, and working together.
Okay, lovely. These are the final words then. Thank you very much, TJ, for joining us, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
panel.